everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Many of you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us today is an author making their official debut here on the show. Now, fueled by at least 2 cups of coffee, my guest's vivid imagination and his love for science fiction has devoted himself to delivering the following: fun stories, quality writing and escapism, and more. If that doesn't sound like something that's right up your alley, strap in, watch for stray blaster bolts and more. And as my guest says, you're in for one hell of a ride. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, author Mr. David Hart. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Like you said, I'm David Hart, born and raised in New Jersey. I've loved sci-fi all my life, and I decided I want to write it.
Awesome. Now, without giving too much away, we'd like to share with our viewers and listeners some of your projects that you're working on. It could be currently published, works in progress, or upcoming works.
Sure. So the first series that I'm writing right now is called Starborn. So far, I started back in 2018, so I have 5 books written already. I'm working on the 6th one. So all of
Nice.
those books, there's going to be 9 in total. They're all coming out next year.
Nice, nice. And for our viewers who are just learning about this series, what can you give them as a little teaser, a window into the series that you have created?
Sure. So the first book at its core is a revenge story. You have the main character, Captain James Severe, unfortunately got caught in an ambush by the alien warlord that nearly wiped humanity out. So his mission now is to find out why he suddenly showed up and to kill him. Of course, there's going to be some personal ties to that. He's going to have to make some decisions about whether he puts his duty first or his desire for revenge first.
Ooh, I love it. I love a classic revenge story. So before we dive further into the creation of the series, starting with the first book, let's talk a little bit more about you, David. So as you said just now, you began writing the story back in 2018, but I'm curious, what sort of instilled in you this passion for the written word? Were you always a storyteller growing up, or was there a specific aha moment that really pushed you down that road?
I've always been a storyteller, whether it was with my Star Wars action figures as a kid. Of course, as with most writers, I feel like nowadays, I started with fan fiction as a kid with Dragon Ball, Halo, Mass Effect. And it was like 2015 when I actually thought, you know what, I want to tell stories for a living.
Nice, nice. So, what would you say was your definitive aha moment for the creation of your series back in 2018?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I actually told a little bit of that story in my first newsletter. And originally, because when I was a teenager, I used to be more into drawing than I am now. So I
Oh, okay.
wanted to, yeah, I wanted to kind of exercise myself and start drawing without references. Because, I'd be like looking at pictures like Dragon Ball, for example, and just
Mm,
copying that on paper. So I wanted to create my own story, my own characters and aliens and stuff. And I had one particular scene in mind, which I won't talk about here because it's in the book.
all
But
right.
I had that in mind, and it kind of just snowballed from there, where I started making aliens, antagonists, and it got to the point where I thought, I could make a story out of this.
Fascinating. Fascinating. I love it. You're pretty much just like me, David. I definitely use a lot of my collectibles when I was younger for storytelling, and also wrote my fair share of fan fiction, namely for Assassin's Creed. Not so much Halo, but am writing my own Halo story down the road. I haven't given too much spoilers away, but you and I are very much the same. So now let's talk about the story itself, beginning with the first book. So walk me through it. You've had this story, had these characters. You now want to fully flesh them out into your own universe. When you embarked on this journey of yours, what were the goals you had as the author, but also the promise that you were going to make to your future readers?
Sure. So the main goal I had, and I'm going to have with all my books going in the future, is to entertain people because I feel like there's not too much of that in at least mainstream outlets nowadays, where they're always trying to go for deconstructions or trying to, subvert all this other stuff. And I just want to tell a fun story. I want people to be entertained. I want them to have some escapism where they can read it and they don't feel like they're being talked down to.
Okay, all right. And I'm actually going to throw in a few fan questions throughout the interview, David, because these are actually really, really fun ones. So this actually is a fan question that one of my viewers sent me, and it is, what was probably the most challenging part of writing this series of yours?
The most challenging part was very in the very beginning because, as I'm writing this first full-length novel that I've ever written, because the only fan fiction, I only finished one, and then I quit the others. So actually writing a full novel was the most difficult part, and going through the different drafts too, because one of the more complicated aspects was letting go of certain set pieces,
Mm.
where in my mind, I had certain ideas that I really wanted to happen, but at a certain point, it felt too contrived to go with the story that I was writing. So I had to learn to let go of certain aspects and go with what felt natural in the story.
Fascinating. And this is another fan question. Do you have a writer's routine or ritual, or are you more of a sporadic writer?
Well, I guess I have a sort of routine, and that was mainly stemming from the fact that as of like a couple years ago, I had a 2 year long writer's block. So
Mm.
I sort of set up a routine so that way I could get out of it, which was to write at least an hour or two a day, no matter how much writing it actually was. Now, at this point, since I've been writing pretty much every day for this past year, I started pushing myself a bit more to do like 1,000, 2,000 words a day, but I guess that's sort of my routine.
Nice, very nice. I've actually met a few other authors on the show who their routines are insane. One guest I had on the show, they said, I forgot if I'm quoting them right. They usually write on average 8,000 words a day. They wake up at 8 in the morning and they do not get out of their chair. Well, maybe for like lunch or like a snack, but they do not leave their room until like 5 in the evening. That is their whole work day. I'm like, wow, that is a commitment to write that many words.
God bless them. I'd love to do that. If I can do that, I could finish a book in a week.
Yeah, you and me both. Absolutely. And another question, which I think is really important to ask, is at what point in your journey creating this series did you reach a point where you could share with others? And the reason I bring this up, David, is that being an author in itself is a very lonely journey in the beginning before we go about publishing it and marketing it. It's just us in the room. And sometimes we're hesitant to share our stories with people, even sometimes family members. So, at what point in your journey did you feel comfortable that you could share with family and friends? And ultimately, what has been the reaction like?
I don't know if I'd say I felt comfortable enough, but I think it was when I was done with my first draft of my debut novel, Starborn the Pale Horse, where I handed it over to a friend of mine. And, he's British. British people have a special sense of bluntness to them. So I
Yes.
thought, you know what? Yeah, I'll give it to him. He'll give me a brutally honest critique, which he did. And it really helped and gave me a little bit more confidence in what to do, what not to do. And that eventually led to me handing the story over to some of my family members. And that was partly why I really focused in on setting the publishing date to 2026. Because, I was born later in my mom's life. I think she was 42 when she had me. So a lot of my family members are on the older side. And some of them have passed away without ever reading my story. And that kind of kicked me in the gears. Like, you know what? I really got to get going. I got to start publishing.
All right. Nice. Very awesome. Now, another fan ties into this is that how do you handle negative critiques or negative reviews as an author? Because I think we've all experienced that in some way or another. And I'm very interested of how you handle it, David.
Well, with me too, because since I am pre-debut, I really don't have much experience at all, especially with military science fiction, because I've never been in the military before. So I take the criticism in stride and realize, all right, these people are more experienced than me. like my editor, he was in the Coast Guard. And so when he points out stuff about the military that I got wrong, who am I to say, no, you're wrong? He's like, well, I guess I got it wrong. And, some of the critiques are, you have to take it in stride and find the humor in it. So I remember one specific point that my editor pointed out was that I was using soldier and Marine interchangeably, which is not right. Soldiers are the Army and Marines are the Marine Corps. And so the note that he had add was, if you ever catch a Marine hearing you say this, you're going to live to regret it. Oh, you know what? Fair enough.
That's true. That is very true. As the son of a Marine, I can definitely tell you, because I'm also working on my own military historical fiction, and of course, I'm starting off with the Army first for my first story, but I definitely tend to write about the Marines and love writing scenes in books that really captivate audiences. And this actually is a double fan question from one of my viewers, and they ask, throughout your series so far, what has been your favorite scene to write, and also what has been the most difficult scene to write?
Geez, well, my most difficult scene to start off with has been actually a lot of the scenes in the fifth book, because one of the POV characters, because my books have multiple POVs,
Right.
so one of the POV characters was an AI, and so I had to really think in terms of AI stuff, like how does a machine speak? How do they think? How can I write that? So that's the
Right.
most difficult. And my favorite was probably one from the first book, was from the villain's POV. And it's really, that whole storyline has a sort of undertone of tragedy to it, because it kind of highlights what happens when you don't communicate properly.
Interesting. Fascinating. All right. I like it. I like it. So now here are some reflective questions, Dave, which I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on. Now, this question, I'll give a little context for it. So as I mentioned in the beginning, starting off as authors, it is a very lonely journey, a lonely venture, because it's all on us. We know the story better than anyone else. We know how it's going to end. We know the characters. They are a part of us. And I think as authors, we imprint an aspect of ourselves into these characters. And when we go about publishing these stories, we then find ourselves in the midst of being authors in the digital age. And I like asking this question in particular because it really makes us think of what that truly means. Because before social media, you did have the internet and sharing all of our work with websites, newsletters, and stuff like that. Social media, you're able to reach the world in of itself, which is huge, but that also comes at a cost. So on one side, you're able to reach out, make connections with fellow authors, make your team of editors, narrators, beta readers, and ARC readers, your street team, what have you. But on the other side, unfortunately, going back to the reviews, we do leave ourselves exposed to a lot of negativity, hate speech, trolls, what have you. And that can be very detrimental to an author's self-confidence. And that buildup of anxiety does exist, because if you sell a really good book, there are expectations readers want that, is the next book going to be out soon? Is it going to be better? And that puts a lot of pressure on us to deliver something. And that, unfortunately, as I've talked to a lot of authors on the show, has derailed some goals here and there. And of course, we wouldn't be authors if we didn't have, of course, the dreaded imposter syndrome in the back of our minds, just waiting to strike. So ultimately, David, here's the question. How do you handle sort of that imposter syndrome as an author, which also can tie into the writer's block? And then what does discipline you to be the best author you can be? Because as you mentioned before, there seems to be this trend, the tropes of deconstruction, revitalization, and kind of shifting away from just telling really good stories, because that's what people really want. And ultimately, they're missing that.
Yeah, so for the imposter syndrome stuff, my way of dealing with that kind of stuff is really the man way of doing it. I just don't think it. I just ignore it, push it under the rug. Like, you know what? It's fine. As long as I don't acknowledge it, it doesn't acknowledge me. But so what was the second question again?
The second question is, what does discipline you to be the best author you can be. And also to add to that, it's one thing to just, create a book and sell the first book as an author and commit to that. It's another thing entirely to make the decision and say, this book is so good, I want to expand on it, which you have. You've written 5 books, and to continuously tell a complete story within those 5 books and possibly more down the road.
Yeah, so with the discipline, I would say, honestly, it's a hard question to answer because this is like stuff that I haven't really thought about. I've kind of just been going with the groove, like, all right, move on to the next one, move on to the next one. But I'd say I've definitely relied on God a lot recently to help me get through this because at the end of last year was when I started the third book. So a lot
Mm.
of these books I've written this year. So just a lot of discipline with that, like of focusing on God and having Him help me get through all of this. And I have to say that a lot of the terrible stories coming out nowadays from Hollywood and all this stuff has been plenty inspiration. Because it makes you think, I can do better than that. That's motivation enough, you know?
Absolutely, 100%. And a lot of my colleagues have agreed that, the trends and tropes, which we'll talk about the business side of being an author, it was fun. There are people that enjoy those type of stories, and, all power to them. But unfortunately, in the case, let's say fantasy, it's been dominated by the romance fantasy genre. And fantasy is not just romance fantasy, it's a lot more than that. And as a epic fantasy writer, I want to make something that's different and yet familiar, which is something that we will also be talking about in the business side. And before we get to that, I did have a few more fan questions that my viewers want to ask, which is this. So, for all of your books, how do you introduce the conflict in your stories? And the tie into that is, how do you add the emotional depth to the conflicts in your stories?
With the emotional depth, I've mentioned this a couple of times, but I don't tend to think about it too much, where I just kind of naturally let it flow.
Mm.
I know we might be end up talking about this later, but with my writers group, I gave them my book, my first book, and they would mention the emotional depth in it, and it's stuff that I never even really thought about before. Where I wrote it, but I thought like, oh, actually, that is kind of deep, isn't it?
All
Like
right. Nice. Very, very nice. And what about the conflicts? How do you introduce the conflicts in your stories?
the conflicts, I usually start right out the get-go in the first chapter where I have sort of like an opening battle, and then at the end of it, it introduces the conflict, or it carries on. Since I'm writing the series, it carries on from the last book where we pick up where the not necessarily a cliffhanger, but a little bit of a cliffhanger, for lack of a better term. It picks off from that, and it sort of reintroduces that and refreshes people's minds.
Fascinating. All right. All right. And this is actually probably a very fun fan question, which I love asking my authors, which is for all of your stories, David, and since these are military based stories, how do you make the atmosphere truly gripping? And what techniques do you use to really immerse your readers in this militarized world that you have created?
So for the last question, I what I like to do to kind of create more intense feelings is by having shorter sentences,
Hmm.
because it feels like it has a bit more of a punch to it, you know? And
All
what was
right.
the first question?
The first question is the first kind of question to that was all of your stories. How do you make the atmosphere
Hmm,
gripping?
Jeez, that's a good question. Again, like, I feel like this is kind of a cop-out answer for me, but I don't really think too much about it. Like, I go into with tense scenes, like the
Hmm.
atmosphere, like the calm before the storm, where
Mm.
people are sort of like waiting for the pin to drop. Right. So
All
like
right.
the for the sixth book that I'm writing right now, there's a scene that, looking back on it, is sort of akin to storming the beaches of Normandy, where they're in
Ooh.
they're in sort of like, if you I guess like with Halo, they called it the gondola, but sort of something like that that travels through the ocean and they're waiting for the doors to open and they know that there's a crap ton of enemies on the other side.
Hmm.
They just have to run as fast as they can. So you have that sort of atmosphere where, again, you're waiting for the pin to drop. So it's like it's the silent moments where the atmosphere is really built up.
Ooh, I like it. I absolutely like it. And now the last three, Frank questions, at least for this part of the interview, for your characters, what inspirations did you use to really bring them to life? And as the author, do you have a personal favorite character that you enjoyed writing about?
See, so for the first question, a lot of my characters were inspired initially from Mass Effect. So, like my main
Mm,
character, James Severe, and when I was doing the drawing project originally in the beginning, I just pictured him as Commander Shepard.
got
So,
it.
the mentor type character, I pictured him as Captain Anderson from that. So, a lot of inspiration came from Mass Effect, especially Mass Effect 1. And characters that I really liked writing were actually from the first book. The main
Ooh.
antagonist, Lord Admiral Korik, and one of his subordinates, Orin, because the Zaulons, which is their race, they're very much akin to the orcs from Lord of the Rings, where
Mm.
there's not really a good Zaulon. The only good Zaulon is a dead Zaulon. And so they're always like thinking of ways to subvert the other, of trying to tear them down and take their spot. So just having that conflict is really fun to write, I've learned. And it's something that's going to come up again in the seventh book.
Fascinating. All right. Okay. And now here's an opinion question, which I would like to hear your thoughts on, David, which I've been asking all of my guests. And it does bring up a huge discussion later on, especially the business side. And that is, of course, for we as authors, indie authors in particular, are we in a golden age or a dark age? Now, the reason why I bring up golden age is that, as I've noticed with a lot of the authors I've had on the show, a lot of us began in the last 5 years of our journey during the lockdown years, the COVID years. And ultimately, when the restrictions sort of, lessen, it just exploded. The industry changed within the last 20 years. Well, it was already changing within the last 20 years, but definitely COVID and the lockdown pushed it even more. And you have new authors, new editors, narrators, artists, what have you, and that's awesome. But also, with the rise of technology and being in the digital age, we also have the rise of AI and artificial intelligence trickling down into the publishing industry, from AI being used to write books, AI being used as editing in the sense of being taking like the full editing jobs, and now more recently, AI taking jobs in narration. So ultimately, David, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Where do you see yourself on this discussion of, are we in a golden age or are we in a dark age? Or, like most of the authors I've had on my show, are we sort of in the middle?
So I don't think we're in either. I think, and this term has been used before, so I'm not going to claim I'm the first one to use it, but we're in an iron age where it's not as shiny, it's not as pristine as the golden age, but it's in an age where if you put in the work, you're going to get really far, but you're going to have to put in the work. You're going to have to pay for the editing yourself, the cover art yourself. You're going to have to, sometimes if you can't afford it, you may have to learn how to be a designer yourself or to edit your own books, which is difficult. So
Mm-hmm.
it's going to take a lot of work, especially with the marketing. But if you put in the time and effort to do it, then you're going to go far. It may not be initially, but eventually, if you stick to it, once you build up a catalog, you will go far. And with the AI stuff, I think, and I've gotten this quote from a YouTuber, Robert Meyer Burnett, who he's more in the movie side of things, but what he's said before is that authenticity is the currency of the future. And so
Mm.
you're gonna have AI stuff out there, and eventually it'll get fine. Where like they can tell stories, they may not be great, but they're fine, and the general audience will like it and accept it. But there's always going to be a market for you know, authentic stories told by humans. Same as how there's still a market for oil painted portraits or photography when you could just do Photoshop. There's always going to be a market for human stories. And maybe
Yes.
they won't make a lot of money, but there'll be a niche. And there's nothing wrong with being a niche.
Absolutely. And as one guest I had on the show perfectly said, is that AI has made book creation more mass produced, which I do agree in that regard. But I love how we describe, writing or using AI to write a book. He said it's, and I quote, asking AI to write a book for you is like asking an alcoholic seventh grader to write a book for you. It's not going to be perfect. You're not going to understand it. It's going to have a lot of issues. And ultimately, you're going to have to end up doing it yourself. And the perfect quote he had, almost like to what you said, David, is that writing stories or writing in general is not an indulgence, it's an obligation.
Mm. Yeah. And I think depending on how AI is used, I think it's best used as a tool. So, like,
Yes.
I've been using it more with research because there are some questions that I just can't Google. Like, for the fifth book I wrote, one of the questions I had to ask was, how big does a Dyson sphere have to be to encapsulate a solar system? I can't Google that question. I'm not going to get an answer to it. So, with stuff like that, ChatGPT is pretty helpful. And of course, you take it with a grain of salt. Like just recently, it was adamant that Monday was the 22nd of July. It was not. So you always take it with a grain of salt, you
Absolutely,
know?
100%. Now we arrive into the business side of being an author. So, as a little icebreaker question, David, when you began your journey as an author, publishing your first book, what was some of the surprising things you've learned about publishing your first book, and has it changed over time?
Well, I'm still learning right now. The first book is set to come out February 11th next year. So I've learned a lot of things already, like just setting up the pre-orders for Amazon, because initially, I'm doing this all through Ingram Spark. So
Mm,
initially I used one of their free ISBNs, and then I later decided, you know what, let me buy my own so that way I have more freedom. I had to set up a whole new book. The process for pre-orders. It's been interesting setting up the Amazon author account, the Goodreads, because I never use Goodreads. So it's just been a lot of like, oh, okay, that's how this goes. And I'm a technological caveman, so a lot of this stuff is way over my head. Like setting up my newsletter last Friday,
mm,
I was like, I thought I had everything good, and it just wasn't working, and I was having a little bit of crash out. I'll admit it. And the next morning, unironically, all I had to do was turn it off and on again.
mm.
I was like, man, I don't know whether to be happy it was that easy or to be pissed off that it was that easy and I didn't figure it out. So it's just a lot of trial and error.
Absolutely, 100%. And kind of being into that, so for all of your books, did you have an idea of your audience in mind? Because I think that is important to discuss with authors or as authors, is that, for ourselves, when we write our books, we are the target audience, viewers and listeners. We know the story better than anyone else. But when we go about publishing it, we have to figure out, okay, who is actually going to read this? And they always say to your target audience, well, I've talked to a lot of authors, and it varies sometimes. Sometimes it's the readership. And even within the readership, you have to figure out, okay, if you're going to market to a readership, what readership is it? YA, NA, AF. So ultimately, David, here it is. For all of your books, A, do you have a good idea of your audience? And B, do you have a good idea of the readership your books fall under? And has that been a challenge to make sure that it stays within the same readership, or possibly, depending on the books, maybe they go into other readerships?
I don't think it's been too difficult because one of the things that I've been experimenting with was ads on Instagram. And one of the most engaging age groups that I've had is between the 25 to 34 age. So I'd say firmly in the adult camp. I'd like to think that my stories can also be read by teenagers and stuff. 'Cause, there is swear words, there is a little violence, but it's nothing kids have to see nowadays if they play Grand Theft Auto.
Hmm.
And for the, again, I'm targeting mostly the military sci-fi, but on the lighter side, where, again, since I'm not military, I don't have too much experience with that. The accuracy isn't going to be 100%. So, kind of like similar to how you have light sci-fi that doesn't go into the tech too much, is like light military sci-fi.
All right, perfect. And this is actually a very fun question, which I always like to ask my guests, which is the author's voice, understanding our individuality, but also understanding the genre that we're getting into. Now, as you said perfectly, David, in the beginning, that the books are coming out now, they are either deconstructing, they're turning the stories on its head, and some other books are coming out are like so new that it completely alienates the reader. So, as authors, we find ourselves in this tightrope balance of we want to showcase our individuality, but we also have to understand the genre that we're getting into because the audience does have expectations and certain books have to follow a certain way. So, for you, David, and your books that you have written and the future books that you are currently writing, how have you been able to balance the two to really highlight your book? Because ultimately, you want your readers to open your book and say, yep, this is David's voice. It's not um, a Tom Clancy-esque voice. It's not so-and-so's voice. It's your voice.
It's easy to an extent for me to understand what these readers want because I'm one of them too. I like reading those books. I'm a big J.N. Chaney fan. I've read some of his books. So understanding what they want, I like to think that I've been doing a good job. We'll see in February. But as far as differentiating myself, again, like you have like the certain styles where you start off with a big bang. You start looking out as you go into the middle of the book, it's a little bit calm. And then the third part is really high action, high intensity. And I think it's not something that I've read before. And granted, maybe I just haven't read enough, but
Right.
I think that'll differentiate me. Is that it's
All right.
very high on the action and not necessarily something that you would think is emotionally deep at first glance, but it could surprise you.
Awesome. All right. And also within the fan question, I did have two more fan questions that I really wanted to ask you. And the first fan question is, tropes always seem to be present in modern storytelling now, but there's not a lot of themes that are present in modern stories. So for you, David, what are the themes that you really want to highlight and push for your readers? And the second fan question is ultimately, what do you want readers to take away from your books?
So for the themes, it's not something that when I'm in the early stages of the books when I'm doing the outline, it's not something I think about too often where when I'm in the outline, I think, okay, what's the theme for this? But
Mm,
as I've gone on with writing the series, I think the overarching theme will be coming together in the face of Armageddon. So, we saw that like with Independence Day, for example, where when the aliens invaded, everybody put their problems to
yes.
the side, even if it was just for a little bit to deal with the threat. We saw that with Lord of the Rings, I'd say. And, ideally that would have been the case for Game of Thrones, but I digress.
Mm-hmm.
And for the second question, again, I'm sorry, I'm showing my bad memory here. What was the second question?
No problem. The second question is ultimately, what do you want your readers to take away from your books?
I want them to take away that they had a good time, that they had fun reading it, that it's a story that goes by quickly when you read it, where you look at, you may have like a 500-page book of, 500-page book of mine, and you think, oh, that actually went by really quickly, and something that they can go back to and read again. Because sometimes you have like, again, I'm using movies a lot as an example, but you have movies like Logan or Joker or The
Right.
Father with Anthony Hopkins where they're good movies, but it's not something that you'd want to put on again for fun. You're not having a date night and thinking, oh, let's watch The Father. I want a story where you can pick up anytime you want and have a fun weekend reading it.
Awesome. Awesome, David. And we're nearing the end. So they are the second to last question, which I think is important to talk about, which is networking, which is huge for us as authors. Networking is vital, especially now in today's digital age. So for you, David, are there any specific people you would like to give a personal shout out to who have helped you along the way? And ultimately, in your opinion, how important is it for new authors to really begin networking and growing their team?
I think it's very important because even if it just starts out as commenting on other people's pages, like I can't talk too much about other social media platforms, but I've noticed with Instagram, a lot of my followers are other authors. So it's a lot more of an author social media platform where you can connect with other people. And all you have to do is comment on their pages to start knowing them a little bit better, start liking their posts and stuff.
Hmm.
And for the author who helped me the most, let me get his name up just to make sure I don't get it wrong, because knowing me, I would. But the one who's helped me the most is J.S. Harmon. He's also gearing towards his debut book in September, Dark Sands. And he's helped me a lot with the cover reveal, because that's coming up next week, actually. And
Ooh.
yeah, so he's helped me a lot with that, like, what I should do, how to go about it. So he's been a lot of help actually. So he's definitely the person who's been the most helpful.
Awesome. And now here's the final question, David, which is also more of like a little scenario. And the first, before we go to the scenario, the one thing I think we need to touch on is that for anyone going to this industry, just fair warning, this is not a get rich quick industry. It's a long hours, it's a lot of hard work, it's a lot of dedication, it's a lot of grinding. The goals have to be realistic because there is no guarantee your book's going to be a financial success. I just want to say that first and foremost. I've been writing since 2020. I've only got 3 books out. It is a grind, but I've learned a lot from a lot of people that I've interviewed on my show and also people who I've met at conventions and festivals, and it given me a lot of great advice. And I definitely feel there needs to be workshops that teach, you know, aspects of the writer's journey. So let's imagine this scenario, David. Let's say down the road you are hosting or being asked to join an event and you are giving a workshop slash seminar. And of the numerous topics that you would want to share with the classroom of new and aspiring writers, what is the one topic that you would like to share with that class that could also be seen as advice or a pearl of wisdom?
I would say the most the most valuable information I can give is that traditional publishing is out of date. It's antiquated. You don't need it because a lot of you think about the benefits that traditional publishing can give, like, oh well, they can do the marketing for you, they can do the cover art. Most traditional publishers nowadays, unless you're one of the big people like Stephen King or whoever, they're really not going to do any marketing for you. I've heard cases of people finding out through fans that their book is out. They had no idea. The cover arts is typically not too good with traditional publishing. You don't have a say in it. It's usually very generic. Like a lot of the stuff you see in Target or Barnes and Noble, get stuff like that where it doesn't tell you anything about the book. So I don't think you really need to do traditional publishing anymore. Again, it's going to be a lot of work, but if you put in the effort, then you're going to see rewards eventually. And yeah, another thing, don't go to college. College can help, but it's not worth putting yourself in debt over. I was homeschooled. I never did college, and I think I'm doing pretty good. And if anything, I'm making sure my editor has work. So I'm helping fund his career. So at least there's that. But it can help, like college can help, but by far it's not needed for writing. Just the best thing you can do is write. Don't buy books on how to write, just write. And reading helps.
Absolutely, David. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude this amazing author interview here on the show. A huge thank you to Mr. David Hart for making his official debut on the show. Now, David, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out? And the pre-order links for your books, when should those be up for people to pre-order?
Sure. So people can find me on Instagram at david.hart.author. That's where I'm most active. I post there usually at least twice a day. I also have the newsletter that I launched last week. You can go to my website, davidhartauthor.com, and sign up for that. You get a free story with it too. And for the pre-order links, that's going to be going up on Thursday, the 31st, same as the cover reveal. So it's exciting times.
Awesome. I'll link all those down below in the description of this video. Thank everyone for joining us for another amazing author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. A huge thank you to David for making his official debut. We wish him the very best with the launch of all of his books, and hopefully we can have him back on the show for the remaining of the books, and possibly maybe a different one in a series, maybe a new series that he's working on that he hasn't told us yet. So make sure to follow David on his social media, as well as like, comment, and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with new episodes. And as always, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you all in the next episode before the end of the month.